This experience happened to me when I was 14 years old. I hadn't spoken to anyone about the event since it happened, not even my significant other. But I'm 20 years old now, about to double major with my first 2 degrees in psychology and anthropology. Recently as well, for reasons unknown to me, the memories of this strange happening have resurfaced and are continuing to plague my waking thoughts, as well as my unconscious and subconscious too. As we are taught in psychology, talking about the situation could help with repressed trauma. So here it goes. So I live in the high desert mountains of Southern California, situated just below the Nevadas. My town is no booming metropolis by any means. At the time, our largest market was a Kmart, one of the last still in business, I might add. And I think that we only had like 4 stoplights in the whole town. And this takes place in a subsection of the town about 13 miles from the shops, I'd say, banks and restaurants, in a small community larger inhabited by retirees. It's smack dab in the middle of summer, and the temperatures were well into the high 90s to low 100s. My nightly routine would consist of walking my Australian Shepherd, but I would always wait until it was almost dark to avoid the heat. I grabbed my phone, a small pocket knife, some headphones, my pup, and I set out for my nightly walk. My community is also home to a significant amount of equestrian riders, as well as cattle ranchers too. The trails that I walked were designated horse riding trails set between pastures. That night, I had decided to take the horse trail that stretches for approximately 2 miles between back-to-back paddocks. It's basically a long, narrow trail that is between very large backyards. My ending destination was the Equestrian Center, a communal equestrian park where all types of horse riders could enjoy various activities on their horses. So making my way through the sandy terrain of the trail, it was nearly dark now. The sky was becoming a deeper shade of blue every time that I looked up, and my dog was becoming harder to see as well. I estimated my arrival at the Equestrian Center to be around 15 minutes from my current position, so I sent a text to my mother and I said, "I'll be at the Equestrian Center in about 15 minutes, could you meet me up there? I'm too tired to walk back." My mother replied, "Sure, I'll leave in 10 minutes. And at this point, I was just outside the east entrance of the Equestrian Center, where the Enchanted Forest Trail connects to the straight trail that I was on. Sort of like maybe like a 3-way intersection. You can either go left into the Enchanted Forest Trail or go straight into the Equestrian Center. But before I reached the intersection of the trails, I noticed a weird shift in my dog's behavior as she became anxious and seemingly worried about something. She had her eyes fixated to the forest and stopped dead in her tracks. I played it off as just another animal within the forest, like a bobcat or a boar, as they weren't uncommon in this area. I gave her a slight tug on her collar, although she was still incessantly focused on the forest. But with a little more convincing, I was able to get her moving forward, pushing towards the Equestrian Center where my mother would be waiting for our arrival. And now it was nearly pitch black, with only the moon guiding me with its low light, and there was just the slightest of visibility, forcing me to turn on my cell phone's dim flashlight. Entering the Equestrian Center now, I noticed something that startled me immensely. There was a very tall person, a man about 10 to 15 feet into the Enchanted Forest Trail, with his back towards me, standing completely still, his head facing the sky and his hands open, palms pointing in front of him while his arms are at his side. He was tall, maybe about 6 feet if I had to guess, slim build, short dark hair, was wearing what looked like to be light blue scrubs, or at least a very thin blue napkin-like material, and was also barefoot. But what startled me the most was his demeanor and what he was doing. His stance was enough to scare anyone in that setting, but as I approached him slowly, it appeared to me that he was shaking, vibrating, or slightly convulsing, but doing so while standing. It didn't seem like he had any control over it too, although he remained balanced perfectly. Scared though now, and not entirely sure what to do, I asked him, "Hello? Excuse me?" I paused momentarily and raised my voice slightly with the next question. "Is everything all right, sir?" When I said that, he stopped shaking altogether, but still doesn't turn around or move another muscle. He just remains that same creepy position and doesn't even move. For a brief moment too, I honestly thought that maybe I was imagining this. But then I glanced down at my dog, and she was also concerned with the state and condition of this man, and also began growling quietly. It was at that point too that I knew that this all wasn't in my head. But when I looked back up, he had moved closer to me, about 7 feet closer in fact, now almost on my trail's path. I had only looked at my dog for a split second, and he did it without even making a sound. He still wasn't facing me either, and his hands were still open, head still facing the sky. But I wasn't about to wait and see what this guy was doing or what his intentions were. So, slowly and steadily, I eased my way past him towards the equestrian center, as quietly as I could before I felt like I was at a safe enough distance to start sprinting as fast as I could away from this guy. When I finally reached the first arena of the equestrian center, I sort of looked back into the direction of the forest, completely out of breath now, and there he was. This guy was standing at the edge of the trail outside of the forest, just standing there. But now he was facing me. I was too far away to see his face, and frankly, I just didn't want to. I couldn't make out features. All I could see was his silhouette illuminated by the moonlight, peeking through the forest trail. And I continued to just run with no intention of stopping, until I found someone. And man, I had never been so happy to see my nagging neighbor Penny and her mooding mare, Jolene, riding in the Milano area. She noticed my distress, but due to her already harsh opinions of me, I had told her that I'd been on an endurance run and was just very out of breath and tired. I wanted to avoid any sort of small-town gossip as much as I could, to be honest, but my mother arrived with impeccable timing too, and during the ride home, I just broke down into a state of paranoia, distress, and panic at what I had just witnessed. My mother, my poor mother, didn't know exactly what to make of it, so she recommended that I file a police report with the local PD. About an hour after getting home, an officer shows up to take my statement. Following up the next day, the same officer claims to have went and checked out the area, but didn't find anyone or anything out of the blue, apart from some partial bare footprints. But there's nothing incriminating or suspicious about someone going for a walk without shoes, so he just sort of played it off as a joke and accused me of being under the influence, but I can assure you that I was completely sober. And nothing ever came out of this too. I eventually attended weekly therapy sessions for almost 2 years following this event, and I never went on walks by myself ever again too. I had night terrors about the man, and sometimes I still do. I still don't know what to make of it all, but I'm doubtful that I ever will. When I was in my early 20s and living in Chicago, I really wasn't making much money. But when I found this apartment, it was too good to be true. The top floor of a duplex with 6 rooms for $775 a month. The agent who showed me the apartment stressed to me that the landlords were very religious. I didn't have a problem with that, even if it did sound a little bit ominous. The landlords were an elderly couple that lived downstairs. They seemed okay at first, but then when they saw that I was having my boyfriend over, things started to get really weird. For instance, one day I was in my office writing. I hear a knock at the door. I open it, and it's the old lady from downstairs. But before I can say hello, she says, "Have you ever gotten an abortion?" I shut the door in her face. I mean, no thanks. But this was a colossal mistake. So, the house was laid out kind of weirdly. There was a door at the bottom of a flight of stairs that I thought led to a communal laundry room, but after accidentally opening it once, I discovered it led directly into my landlord's living room. And unfortunately, I learned this one the hard way. was in my kitchen cooking, my boyfriend was at work, and I was by myself when I heard what sounded like the click of a door. Okay, I say out loud. What the heck was that? I didn't really make the connection that it could have been the door that led into their living room, but I walked into the hallway and I look around. I don't see anyone at the end of the hallway. I poke my head into all of the rooms, but there's nobody there. Then I look down the staircase leading to their house, and the neighbor lady is standing there just staring me down. I screamed. She flinched and stepped back into her apartment and swung the door shut. After that, every time that I left the house, I spent every possible moment out of the house after that incident too. I would come back and something would always be moved. A window would be shut. At once, the shower was dripping and my towel was damp. I couldn't lock the door too because, it was technically a door to their house. They were the only ones with the key anyway. But the knocking got so frequent, 3 or 4 times a day, that me and my boyfriend propped up an old mattress so that we wouldn't have to hear it while we slept. The second to last straw, though, was when I opened the door for work and the stairs were completely gone. I physically couldn't even leave my house because there were literally no stairs there. They had been dismantled and were now sitting on their porch. I called them repeatedly, but they didn't answer. Finally, their son came out of the house and explained that they were remodeling their porch. And then he told me that I had to cut through their apartment downstairs. So I descended the stairs and opened the door, and they were both sitting at their filthy kitchen table just staring at me. The phone was in its cradle. They must have heard it ringing, but they just kept staring at me with this blank look on their faces. I crossed their kitchen as quickly as I could, and I left out their back door. A few days later, I came home from my job and noticed that the bathroom floor was almost completely flooded, like somebody left a faucet on or the shower on or something. The old woman, seeing that I had come home, came upstairs and knocked, screaming at me that I had flooded the bathroom and that her son had to come and fix it. And I was so exhausted by this point that I just told her, what the heck, okay. Her son comes by a few hours later, and he is absolutely off his face on something. I open the door and I tell him that I need at least an hour or so before he comes in, and then he picks something up and swings it at me. It was a huge wrench. I somehow duck out of the way and he stumbles over. I book it down the newly repaired stairs as quickly as possible and call the police. They come by and take down a complaint, but claim that since there was no physical contact, that they can't really do anything. I learn later that the old couple has a daughter on the force. In the middle of the night, me and my boyfriend and several of his friends packed all of our stuff into a Chevy Astro, and we just lived in hotels and a van for a month until we found another house. They never did attempt to contact us again, which, for that, I'm thankful. When I was a teenager, my older brother moved out and my parents both worked late. So, occasionally, I would spend evenings by myself after school. We lived in the countryside, a few miles outside of town, and had a good collection of neighbors. The day just went as normally as ever as well. I went to school, got home, turned on the TV, had a snack, and texted one of my friends who I had a crush on. It wasn't long afterward that I noticed a man outside of my house, and he walked past a few times. He wasn't an ordinary person walking around the block, too. He looked scraggly and sort of unkempt. I ducked as far as I could behind a chair, still trying to see him out of the living room windows, hoping that he didn't see me. But soon, he came to the front door and he knocked. I was texting my friend the entire time, increasingly getting freaked out, obviously. As he knocked on the door, I stupidly went to answer it as well. I had my phone with me with 911 at the ready. I tried to sort of silently unlock the door to not alert the man, and then I opened the door a crack. There was a screen door separating myself and the man. I was ready to slam the door and lock it if anything happened. but the man just sort of looked at me with crazed and paranoid eyes. He had a large dark beard and looked to be maybe in his late 50s or early 60s if I had to guess. He seemed out of breath and his face was just drenched with sweat. He was larger too, more the reason to keep my guard, right? But I sheepishly said hello. "Please, call the police, they're after me," he said in an exhausted smoker voice. He kept looking at the road and tensed whenever a car would occasionally pass. Who's after you?" I asked, getting ready to slam the door. "Listen, I barely escaped. They were right behind me, please. Can I come inside?" And at this, I knew to call the police. "Just wait here, okay? I'll get someone to help." My heart was completely in my throat at this point. I didn't know if this guy was going to try and force his way into the door, so I quickly shut it and I locked it. I ran to check the back door as well, and locked that as well as I called 911. My heart was racing and I could barely tell the operator my information, but they said that they would send somebody out. It wasn't long too until a patrol car arrived, but it felt like forever, I can tell you. The entire time I kept watching the man, who then walked into my driveway, pacing nervously. The officer got out and proceeded to talk with this guy, and they got in the car and they left. I still have no idea what happened to this guy too, nor if he was even telling the truth. He could have been drunk or crazy, but it was genuine fear in his eyes, I think, when I looked at him. Something truly scared this guy, and it scared me to think that there could be someone out there that wanted people for whatever reason, as much as he seemed to be letting on. Anyway, like I said, I really don't know what happened to the guy, but I do wish him all the best. I've lived in Southern California my entire life, pretty much. And if you know anything about California, it's very diverse. Up north is filled with mountains and trees, and the south is a lot more, well, city-like. And this summer, I decided to take a trip to Lake Tahoe. It's a beautiful place, and my first time being upstate. But I'll chop this story up into segments of sorts to make it easy to understand. So day one, I settled into the cabin at around 5 p.m. After an 8-hour drive, I was pretty tired too, so I went and lay down in the bed that was in the loft. It was quiet too. It was like being in a different world. I was so used to cars zooming by and people talking right outside of my house, but here it was quiet. I fell asleep fairly quickly too, but around 4 hours into my sleep, I jerked up from my sleep. I looked around for a bit before hearing a strange tapping noise. I looked around to see where it was coming from, but to no avail. It honestly sounded like somebody was tapping on the window part of the back door, but in the end I just figured that I was being paranoid, and I fell back to sleep. Day 2, nothing happened that day, and I slept fine. Day 3, I woke up early in the morning, maybe 4 o'clock, and I heard a crash coming from the attic ladder that was placed conveniently right behind the couch that I was sleeping on. And I completely froze. And then I heard footsteps. You know that feeling you get when you feel like somebody is staring at you? That's how I felt. I was on my side, staring straight ahead, when suddenly I felt somebody or something crawl over me. I felt their 2 hands on either sides of me, and I knew their face was only inches away from mine. Like I said, I was facing straight ahead, and I wasn't going to turn to face to see who it was. They stayed there, too, for what must have been at least 2 minutes, until I just felt them crawl backwards, and then off the couch. I heard the dog let out a sort of muffled bark, in which time someone shushed her, then let out a good girl. The presence stayed there for what felt like forever, until I heard footsteps going out of the back door. Still, I didn't move. I was paralyzed with fear. But needless to say, I didn't go back to sleep that night. I checked on my friends a bit later on when I felt the coast was clear. None of them had left their rooms that night, and I told them my experience, and they said that was weird and I was being paranoid. And in the end, I sort of halfway agreed with them, and our day just went on as planned. Later that day, after a day at the lake with my friends, we came back to a quiet and cozy cabin. The caretakers of the cabin told us that there was a river a bit farther back into the woods, about a 15-minute walk, and my friends decided to stay back and rest, so I took some bug spray and a small backpack with some snacks and my phone. It was a pretty straightforward trail. There was tall grass on either sides of the trail, and it was a thin path, but pretty easy to navigate. When I got to the riverbank, there were 2 picnic tables there. I didn't want to get eaten alive by mosquitoes, and I'd stupidly worn sandals. So I put my bag on the table and fumbled around with some stuff for a bit, and then I started my walk back to the cabin. For some odd reason, too, the path just seemed distorted. What was once a straightforward trail was now covered in rough terrain. I noticed the tall grass on the side of the path that had been disturbed, and it was as if something huge, and I mean gigantic, had walked across the long grass. At first, I thought maybe it was just a bear, since the locals had told us that bears were a problem this time of year, but the sheer size of it made me sort of second-guess it. I was a bit taken aback by this, but I continued and I made it back to the cabin. Then I went back to the river eventually, and I was a little frightened now, but I kept telling myself that I was just freaking myself out and I should enjoy the nature. I sat down on one of the tables and watched the river for a bit, but after a while I could have sworn that there was something staring at me. I looked around, assuming one of my friends was on their way to prank me, but there was no one. Across the river, I noticed a bit of brush that was shaken up. There was a clearing in the bushes that was fenced off by 2 logs in a sort of X shape. The longer that I sat in that spot, the more worried I became. I just couldn't help but feel that there was something behind the thick brush that I couldn't see. I went down the river at that point, hoping to come across some kind of life, but there was literally nothing. No fish, no frogs, no roads, just mosquitoes, and a bunch of them at that. Disappointed now with the lack of anything, really, I just went to sit back at the table, and that was when I heard it. It was a noise that I just really find hard to describe. It was a scream, but more like a gurgle, as if whatever it was had a mouthful of water. It was inhuman, definitely, but I froze, and in that moment I should have been running for my life, I know, but in the end I just froze. I heard rustling in the bushes behind me, the ones that I was worried about earlier. Then again the scream, and it was the loudest thing that I'd ever heard. And then I just ran. I sprinted my butt through that forest, and what should have been a quick trip back to the cabin was anything but that. Because after about 10 minutes of sprinting, I finally noticed that I was completely lost. I stopped for a few moments, frantic to see if I could find anything that looked familiar, and then I saw a bridge that I crossed on my way there, and I started sprinting that way. I thought to myself, why didn't the damn thing just kill me? I mean, I'd stopped for a good minute, and then I could hear it chasing me again. It felt like it was a game for this thing. What I mean is that every time I stopped, it would as well. Eventually, I finally made it back to my cabin, and instead of going inside, I just sort of stood on the porch. I faced the forest, and I just cried. I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary, but somehow I just knew that it was still out there. I didn't want to turn my back to it, so I must have sat there for hours, just silently crying away, occasionally checking my phone, and, well, writing this down. I don't know what the heck that thing was. The only thing that I can even compare it to is maybe a Wendigo or something, but I've never heard of Wendigos gurgling like that. All I do know is that I will not be going back to that river ever again. If you could please shed some light on what or who might have been out there, then I would really appreciate it. These past 2 days have just been too weird to not be connected. Also, we actually burned some sage that night before heading to bed. Brett, one of the guys there, came up to me at around 4 in the morning and told me that he couldn't sleep. We watched TV for a little while before, again, we hear the taps on the back window. We decided not to check it out because, well, quite frankly, we were scared as heck, but after about 10 minutes, the tapping stopped. But Brett and I took turns on sleeping, and no other strange things occurred that night. Brett and I were actually woken up by loud banging on the shed out back, but that could have been an animal or anything really. But at this point, I'm just really excited to get back to my city life and leave this place forever, and all of its weird stuff behind me. Anyway, I had my friend Brett go up into the attic too, while me and some others watched from below, but there was, of course, nothing up there. And to be honest, I'm really not sure if I feel better or worse, knowing that there's nothing up there. I had just turned 20 in March of this year, and I'd started to get out more on my own. I was always shy and never really wanted to go out alone, but now I started to feel a bit more comfortable. I just ordered myself a pocket knife. I actually have a few now, and would carry it with me most of the time when I went out for my daily walks. And this one time in June was one time that I was blessed to have thought of bringing my pocket knife with me. Let me tell you that. So it was around 8 PM when I decided to go for my walk. Usually I would try and go in the morning or early afternoon, but it had been raining all day, so my walk was pretty delayed. I put on a light hoodie and I was about to head out when I realized that my knife wasn't in my pocket. I went back up quickly and I got it and it was on my way. My usual walk is around 3 to 4 miles, I would guess, and I'm a pretty fast walker, so I could cut the miles to about 2.5 hours max. I would take this side of the street to the main road that had a walkway for about half a mile before it turned into the suburban area. But before you hit that area too, there was this path that cut through a forested area that had a few cabins and parks and whatnot. So, as I made my way, I had noticed a figure hanging beside a tree on the far side of one of the cabins. I took a quick glance at him and continued past him. For your insight too, I'm trans male and 5'1", so I would get mistaken a lot for a small 15-year-old kid. But as I made it to the end of the path, I noticed out of the corner of my eye that the man was now about 15 feet away from me. The dude was pretty tall, at least 6'3", I would guess. He was well built and was wearing torn jeans and a worn hoodie that seemed to be a bit big for him. I began to speed up my walking at this as I turned the corner and shot a quick glance behind me. He was still behind me and just staring at me now as he was making long strides towards me. At this point, I was beginning to freak out. He seemed to be getting closer with every step, and I quickly took a hold of my knife in my pocket and had my finger on the flipper. And the next part has been burned into my memory for life. I felt a large hand grab my shoulder and pull me back. I have no clue how I managed to quickly whip around and flick open my knife like I did and swipe it towards his face in just a few seconds, though it felt like minutes. But the man, in a blink of an eye, jerked his face back, bringing up his hand as my knife sliced his palm of his hand. He let out a sort of pained yell and fell back a few steps, clutching his hand. It felt like I had just scraped him, but his hand was already completely bloody, and a small pool of blood was starting to form at his feet. He looked at me with anger filled in his eyes, and then he just took off the other way. I stood there for a few minutes before realizing what had just happened, and I went home as fast as I could to call the police. I answered their questions, and then they took my knife to get a blood sample of this dude. I was shaken from this experience and stayed with my brother for a few nights. A few weeks later, the cops returned and told me that, yep, they had found the guy. And yeah, he was wanted for sexual assault. I was shocked, but also happy that they had found this guy. My knife was also returned to me a few days later, which I was thankful for. For those who want to know what type of pocket knife it was, It was just a tac force knife, or for those who might know, a TF 705. Earlier this year, to celebrate the 4th of July, I was having a few drinks with my parents, and as we were discussing several different topics, we eventually stumbled into sharing some ghost stories. I mean, we've all heard each other's usual stories before. In fact, I can write verbatim my dad's encounter with an elf, which I always find myself sort of chuckling doubtfully about. But that night, I brought up something that I've really struggled to come to terms with for years now. This took place when I was around 10 years old. I'm 25 now, so this was about 15 years ago. My friends and I lived in different neighborhoods around the town at the time, so since I was really the only kid of my age group who lived in my little part of the suburb, I would occupy my free time by just riding my little mermaid bicycle on the streets. It was a very lax part of the township, typical of the residential areas that surrounded the city. But one summer evening, I was wasting some time just before dinner, I think, by pedaling my bike up the street. When I was rolling to the T-shaped intersection that I would always stop and turn around at, I noticed two girls my age just sitting peacefully in front of the house opposite the intersection. They were staring at me too, almost as if they were aware of my imminent arrival. Both were wearing light-coloured nightgowns, which I thought was a bit strange considering the time of day, and, well, being outside like that. I can't recall if they were twins, but something tells me that they were, but I can't really remember much detail of their faces at all. As I got closer to the intersection on my bike, they called out to me cheerfully, beckoning me with jubilant arm motions to come towards them. And I did. I felt a rush of excitement toil over me at the thought of having a couple of new friends to play with, so I really wasn't asking why they were outside in nightgowns or even where they'd come from. Because, you see, the people that owned the house behind them were quite elderly. I mean, I rarely ever saw them leave the house at all. The edges of the property were quite grown over too, which made the house look neatly nestled away from the road. The only thing that I thought that was strange at the time was that the slight hill that was their front lawn was covered in sort of decorative river rocks, the ones that are smoothly moulded by water and look like little dinosaur eggs maybe. And that's what the girls were sitting on, barefoot and in nightgowns. How uncomfortable, I thought. They were both talking to me, telling me that I should come and play with them. And I said that I would love to, but I would have to bike home first and let my mum know where I'd be. They seemed less than thrilled at that idea and were definitely trying their hardest to coax me into staying there with them, telling me that I didn't need to tell my mum and that she wasn't that far away. I insisted that I'd be back very shortly and hopped on my bike and pedalled home. When I arrived back at my house, I threw my bike into the grass and ran up to our front door, opening it partially to ask my mum if it was alright if I played with two girls up the street. My mum turned around and seemed sort of visibly confused, but she agreed, so I went back. I rode up to the house at the intersection, and when I did, they weren't there. I was a little disappointed. I even felt bad for having to run home first like I did. I walked my bike up the driveway and then proceeded to walk up to the door, knocking on it gently, and an elderly woman opened the door. I told her the girls asked me if I could play with them, and she said, "What girls?" A puzzled look spread across her face. There were two girls outside just a bit ago. They asked if I could play with them." "No kids here, sweetheart. You know, you're the only kid on the street, right?" And then she shut the door. And after that, I never saw or heard of the girls ever again. Now, as I was telling this story to my parents, I sort of paused midway to make the disclaimer that I wasn't sure if this was some kind of extremely detailed dream that I had, sort of mixed up with my memories, or if it actually happened. My mum, though, she told me she actually remembered that day because she never remembered any children living on our street besides me, and it stuck out to her that I had asked to play with two girls up the road. So, after explaining this story to my parents, I ended up doing some research. And apparently, The phenomena of supernatural beings disguised as children, black-eyed children as they're referred to, is an urban legend. I had no knowledge of this being a thing, and although it's debunked, I will say that it's eerily similar to what I experienced with these girls. I don't really remember them having black eyes. In fact, it's almost as if their faces were sort of blurred from my memory entirely. They weren't acting ominous or intimidating, but they wanted me to stay with them in the sort of worst way. Ghosts, a glitch in the system, black-eyed children, or whatever it was. I'm struggling to find an explanation, as it's just been one of the most puzzling things that I've ever experienced. So in April of last year, my boyfriend and I were just walking home from our friend's house. I had just finished my first year at college, and we wanted to go out and celebrate and just have some fun. We live in a pretty rural town, though, and our friends lived on the far side of it, so our walk was about a half an hour or so. I had a drink or two, and I smoked a bit. Smoking always makes me paranoid, and this night was no different. But anyway, we left at maybe 10 or 11 p.m., I would guess, and everything was perfectly normal. Until we got to the end of a long street that would eventually lead to my house. This street always just felt so long to walk. Like, hours can pass, and you can barely make a dent into the amount of steps that need to be made. But the street we turned onto, this road, was maybe 10 blocks from my house. A few minutes after we turned onto this road, I just felt like something was off. But my boyfriend said that I was stoned and reminded me that I'm a pretty paranoid person to begin with. And truthfully, I am. But then this white pickup truck that was parked in front of some house just turns on and begins to drive slowly away and would then park. I watched it to see if it was just me being paranoid or not, but it proceeded to stop a couple of houses down and just sat there with the car still on. As soon as we would get close to it, it would always drive away, parking a little further away each time. This continued too until we got to the end of my street. At this point, I was telling my boyfriend that I don't think I was being paranoid and that this truck was definitely messing with us, and he had also gone quiet. A couple of houses down from mine, the truck drives to the end of the street, at my house on the corner, and there's a dead end right by my house because we live near a river. It stops for a moment at the end and proceeds to turn on their high beams and begin to slowly drive towards us. My boyfriend sticks his arm out in front of me, stopping me from walking any further as this truck continues to approach. My house is really close, but also pretty far to run to at this moment. This truck then slowly drives by us. The windows are tinted, but we can see two silhouettes, and because they had blinded us, we didn't think to look at the license plates or even the model of the truck. And I swear that I felt like that was the night that I was about to die, or worse. My thoughts hurled around in my mind, and I could see that my boyfriend was in the same mindset. My boyfriend, being pretty quick on his feet though, waited until the truck disappeared from sight and took my hand before racing to my house, and then instantly locking the door. He had thought about turning down one of the other streets so that we could try to lose them, but he figured that he'd wait until they were out of sight to book it to my house so they wouldn't see which house that we went into. But we then looked out one of the front windows, very carefully mind you, and saw this truck come back into view and began to drive around the block, presumably looking for us, I suppose. This went on for what must have been 10 minutes, and I called the police to inform them that we'd been followed, but without the license plate or the model, they could only keep their eyes open for suspicious white trucks. I was adamant, though, that these people, they had to have known one of us, if not me, because they drove until they were beside my house. Whether they actually knew it was my house or not, I don't know, but it was really suspicious. My boyfriend tries to insist that it was probably a bunch of kids just trying to mess with us, but I don't believe that for a second. And sure enough, a few days later, we heard that someone was picked up and was last seen in a white truck. Since this night, there have been stories in the paper and online that people have been grabbing other people and these people were trafficked in the area. I'm still seeing reports even today, which prompted this unsettling memory. It makes me wonder if they were some of these people, and if they were after both of us, or maybe just one of us. Or were they truly just a bunch of terrible people trying to mess with us? Either way, I really don't care to find out. So, before I start this, I just want to make it abundantly clear to everyone that, yes, I know I was incredibly stupid, but I was also very young, so you're just going to have to forgive me. So when I was 15, my sister and we actually ran away from home. Dumb decision number one, I know. I was gone for a total of about 6 months, and at some point, for about 2 weeks, we were living in a rundown motel. One night, while I was by myself, I was sitting on the stairs of the motel just flipping through a magazine. Stupid decision number 2. When a grown man walks by me and starts to talk to me. He asks me my name and why I'm sitting outside. I ask him if he's a cop. Extremely stupid decision number 3, since this shows him that I don't want cops involved, as I was a runaway. He asked, do I look like a cop? He didn't, to be honest. He said that he had some alcohol, though, in his room, and that he was willing to share it if I'd like to come up and drink with him. At 15, to me, free alcohol sounded great. So I said okay, and I went to him and to his room. Stupid decision number 4. We got to his room, though, and I began drinking and talking a bit. I forget what I asked him, but at some point I asked him something that made him get his ID out and show it to me. Under his name, too, I noticed that it had a fender under his name in red. Warning bells immediately went off at this, and I asked what that meant, and he replied, what do you think it means? At that point, I just wanted the heck out of there. As I'm thinking that, though, an additional grown man walks into the room. He sees me, smiles, and they both nod to each other, and I am now in a locked motel room with 2 grown men. I turn to the first guy and tell him something, like, I have to get something out of my room real quick, then I'll be right back. I must have sounded believable too, because he said, you'll come right back. I said, of course, I want to keep drinking. He then asked what room number I was in, and I lied and I made one up, of course. And by the grace of God, he actually let me out of the room. I briskly walked back to my room. Not even a minute later, too, the phone rings. I picked it up, and he said, why did you lie to me? I said, what do you mean? You lied about your room number. I watched you go into your room, he told me. I told him that it must have slipped my mind as I was talking to him earlier. He then told me to come back upstairs to his room so that we can keep hanging out. I told him that I'd be right back up, and I then proceeded to unplug the phone from the wall and curl up into a ball since I was so afraid that he was going to try and come and get me. I still to this day do not know why he just let me leave like that. I mean, he didn't have to. Lord knows what would have happened to me that night if I hadn't. It's scary to think about since I was a runaway too. No one would have known anything too. I had no ID and I was going by a different name at the time. I eventually looked up what offender means too, and most websites say that it means the person is a sex offender or out on parole at least. Which means that I was very lucky that night. Surprisingly though, it took me becoming an adult to really realize the danger that I was in that night. To me at 15, he was just a creepy guy, and I instinctively knew that I had to get out of there. It wasn't until years later that I just really, truly understood how bad that situation could have become. I was a high school student living with my mother in a third-floor apartment. I used to sleep in a living room because Well, the apartment only had one bedroom, and it was my mum's. But I was happy with that little space that I had. In fact, I was just a pretty happy kid. I always got up at 6 a.m. to go to school as well, and my mum always got up at 5 a.m. to have time to shower and make breakfast before dropping me at school and heading to work. That morning, I woke up and the lights were all on. Every single one of them, even the one in my room. I went to grab my phone and it wasn't there, which was odd. I headed to the bathroom though and saw that all the drawers and the doors of every furniture that we had were open. I was obviously deeply confused, but anyways, my mum came out of the bathroom and asked me what the heck I was doing. I told her that I didn't know what she was talking about and that I thought that she did that since she's always up 1 hour earlier than me. I also asked if she had seen my cell phone, and then I saw it. Deep inside of her green eyes, the realization. I could see the fear and all of the pieces inside of her head clicking in place. She quickly leapt to the kitchen and she found the window wide open, a kitchen knife on the ground, and some dusty fingerprints on the wall where someone had put their weight on it to climb inside. It was then when my sleepy head put the pieces together too. Someone somehow climbed all the way up of our balcony, got inside the apartment, and robbed us. All while I was asleep in my bed, right there in the living room. She hugged me and asked me if I was okay. I said that I had never heard anything, didn't even wake up in fact when this unknown person turned the lights on and rummaged through all of our stuff. But it was super weird. I mean, I have the lightest sleep since I have memory, and I still do in fact, many years later, but I just didn't hear anything. Also, though, they didn't dare open my mum's bedroom door, so she didn't notice a thing. My grandma seems to believe that some angel protected me in my sleep, and that's why I didn't wake up, but I don't believe in that stuff. In fact, I just don't think they knew that I was there either. The police never found the robber, and we put steel bars on the window after that, but we moved anyways sometime after. But this all happened when I was still in high school. At least 6 years have passed now. My mother and I moved from that apartment. Now I'm grown up and I live with my boyfriend, but even today I'm still paranoid and keep asking myself just, why didn't I wake up? Although I must admit that I am grateful that I didn't. One of the strangest and most unexplainable experiences that I've ever had was as a child, probably aged 10 to 12 or so. I was upstairs in my house walking towards the guest bedroom or the playroom. The hallway was lit up, but the room was dark. I got to the entrance of the room and could very clearly see my dad standing in the middle of it, trying to tie a string around the handle of an old wooden rocking horse that we had sitting in that room. I stood and watched him because I thought that it was super weird that he was doing this and not acknowledging me. The tying motions he was making with his hands were really repetitive too, but otherwise he was just standing still. Suddenly though, I heard his voice coming from downstairs and realized that my parents were downstairs talking. I was gripped with a sudden terror, and at this, I sprinted down the hallway back downstairs. I was afraid of that room for years to come after that as well, and would cover my eyes while turning on the lights, even into high school. As an adult, I'm still a bit uneasy sleeping in that room, and my boyfriend hates to stay in it with me when he visits my parents, but I've never actually had any other weird experiences in it, just that one. That room too wasn't originally part of the house, which was built in 1980, and was later added on in the 90s when my parents actually bought the house. I could write it off as just my eyes playing tricks on me. I know that, but what made it so weird was that he very clearly appeared to be moving, and plus I stopped and stared at the image and it just didn't go away. And I mean, typically when my eyes do play tricks on me, it's always very momentary. I don't know. But what do you guys think? My dad is still living there, quite healthy might I add, so I don't know what happened. So, I'll start with a little bit of background story about the property. This house was built somewhere in the middle of the 1800s. It's belonged to my family since the beginning, and my great-great-grandparents built it from scratch when they moved from Italy to Uruguay. The backyard occupied an entire block, so it was pretty big. During the years, the family began to sell some parts of it, so now it's like a quarter of what it was then, but this house has served as many things: a cinema, 2 churches, a bar, clandestine abortion center, and many stores too. Sadly, a lot of people have died here, including murders, natural deaths, and suicides too. The previous owners, some family friends, said that the last nights they spent there were almost unbearable too. Doors and windows would open and close alone so fast that they had to get out as quickly as they could, and the neighbors always told us that they could hear babies crying in the backyard, where they used to bury the fetuses apparently. Cousins of my mother had seen people in the bathroom mirrors plenty of times. The smells would appear out of nowhere, and just all in all, it was a pretty messed up place. But we moved in 2010, and almost immediately, things started to happen. At first, it started with things like stuff would be missing from places where we left them. Then we could hear conversations in a different language in the backyard at night, but after searching, there was never anybody there. But the thing that creeped the heck out of all of us were definitely the apparitions. So a few months after moving in, my mother woke up in the middle of the night, only to find out that there was a man at the end of her bed with a black plastic bag covering his head. She didn't scream or wake me up, just closed her eyes and prayed until she fell back to sleep again. Now, this became a regular thing too, and we could see different people at any time in the house, and then they would just vanish out of thin air. I remember once too where I went to a sleepover at my cousin's house. It was the same as ours, but just divided by a wall. And when I woke up at 12 a.m., I saw a woman watching me from behind a full-body mirror. I honestly couldn't move, so I ended up just closing my eyes, and when I opened them, she wasn't there anymore. But then I turned my head again, and now she was behind the bedroom door. I closed my eyes again, and then she was just gone. I have many, many stories like this too. On one occasion too, we actually discovered a picture that nobody took in my cousin's place. It appeared to be a baby from another time, maybe. You could sort of guess that by its clothes. But it was definitely the final proof that there was something going on here. So after contacting a medium, she told us that 6 different presences were living in this house with us. And I could tell you like 30 different things that happened here since then, but right now we've just sort of gotten used to this and just live with the knowledge that they're just not going anywhere, and this is where we live. We sort of feel like maybe they're visitors here, or maybe we just tell ourselves that so that we're not so scared. But if you guys want to hear more stories, then let me know in the comment section below, and I'll see what else I can write up. This was back in the 90s when our only option was a landline phone and also dial-up internet. I was around 8 to 9 years old when my mum started leaving me at home with my oldest brother while she went to work. My brother was much older, around 17 at the time in fact. And as most teenage boys, his favorite thing to do was sleep really late during the day and stay up all night playing video games. It was a PS1. Don't come for me, I'm getting old. But I remember being bored just playing with my Barbies in the living room of my house with the blinds wide open to let some light in and save on electricity. I would sit there for hours and play, in fact. When Mum was gone though, she always told us to answer the phone when it rang in case she was calling to check on us and make sure that we were okay. I remember one day specifically, I answered the phone and just heard sort of loud breathing on the other end of the phone. I kept saying hello, but no one would reply, so eventually I would just hang up. This went on daily for like 2 months as well, and it was always in the morning time when my brother was asleep. Being a naive 8 to 9 year old girl though, I didn't really think anything of it, and eventually the call stopped, so that was good. A few months go by, and I'm sitting in my living room floor again when the phone rings. I hear the same breathing again, and I say, "Hello, who is this?" And to my surprise, a man replies and says, "Hello, kitten, do you remember me?" I remember being surprised that he called me kitten, but replying that he must have had the wrong number. And this is where it gets creepy. He then replies, "No, kitten, I have the right number. You're wearing a kitty shirt right now, aren't you?" I remember looking down and immediately panicking and hanging up the phone when I see the tabby kitten on my shirt. The phone then rings again, and I just refuse to answer it. I quickly run up to wake my brother up, and he sleepily follows me down to the living room. The phone rings again, and he answers it, but nobody's there. He then unplugs the phone and tells me that it's just my imagination and to leave him alone so that he can sleep. Being scared, I decided to close the windows though and sit on the couch until my mum got home that afternoon. That night, I told my mum what had happened, but my brother told her that I was making it up and that he didn't see or hear anything. I think that my mum believed me, but she told me to just hang up the phone if it wasn't her and to never open the door for a stranger or anything like that. I agreed, and I told her that I wouldn't. That next day, my mum was off to work again, and she took me to the store with her this time. We were walking around when I noticed a man in a long trench coat. I thought the coat was weird, but didn't really think much of it. We then ran into one of my mum's friends, who has a daughter my age. My mum and her friend were just sort of chatting away, and me and my friend were just sort of standing a few feet from them messing around with birthday cards and stuff. And then we went around to the other side of the cards to take a look there, and we were out of sight of our mums. But suddenly, the man with the trench coat is right next to us, looking at the cards too. He then picks up a card and turns to me and my friend and says hello. Being polite, we responded with a quick hello back. But then he starts picking up cards and saying that he's getting his daughter something and asks what we like. My friend points to a random card and he smiles and says that that's nice. He then picks up another card and shows it to us, and the card has kittens all over it, and he looks directly at me and says, "I'm sure you like kittens, don't you?" I didn't really know how to respond, and I remember feeling extremely nervous, but he smiled when he saw me get nervous, and he says, "Kittens and Barbies, right?" This kicked my fight or flight into action, even at the young age of 8 or 9. I nervously laughed and said that we had to go back to our mums right now. The man then reaches out and grabs my arm. My friend takes off running around the corner to get my mum. The man tries to pull me to the front of the store, but I kick him as hard as I can and go flying out of his grip. He then gets up and runs out the door about the time that my mum makes it over to me. The police are called and a report is eventually filed. To my knowledge, they never actually found the man, but my mum was extremely paranoid after hearing the link between the phone calls and the incident, and she quickly found a new house in the city right over from us, not even a month later. Thankfully, too, that was the last time that I heard from that guy. But it was definitely quite a close call. From 2013 to 2019, I worked in an outdoor education at many different summer camps and outdoor education centres too in Canada, mostly Ontario, but I did spend a season in the Rocky Mountains too. Having grown up going to sleepaway camp and eventually participating in month-long leadership programs with backcountry canoeing components and whatnot, I was well prepared to lead a group of teen girls from a camp in Georgian Bay on a 2-week camping trip in the Tamagami region during my first year as a counsellor. The region is located between North Bay Subjury and Timmins, Ontario. This region is home to many provincial parks, wonderful hiking and even canoeing routes, and the Bear Island Indian Reserve too. Our route was fairly typical and began at the Whitefish Falls region, ending at Highway 11 after 14 days of paddling, hiking, and campfire making. We had a satellite phone to check in with our camp director every day, and in case of an emergency too. We also had multiple exit points along the route. Now, until our second to last night, we were honestly having fun, and it was a relatively uneventful time, besides some mild dehydration and the usual bumps and bruises, that is. Near the end of our trip, we were doing some free camping on the shore of an uninhabited island in Bear Lake that is recognized as a part of Bear Island Indian Reserve. It's a beautiful area, and we were across from the main island that the majority of the 250-person population inhabits. We had put out the fire and had gone to bed when, I would guess, about maybe an hour after falling asleep, I was jarred awake by the sound of a loud motorboat. Obviously, this isn't that weird because it's a large lake and many people use boats to reach the mainland or their homes on secluded islands. However, it was around 11 p.m. now, and things had been quiet for the last few hours. The motor then cut out, and I could clearly hear the sounds of an argument. It sounded like at least one man and a woman, and they were very angry and yelling at each other, although I couldn't hear anything specific because they were too far from shore. And suddenly, the woman screamed, and I heard her splash into the water, and then just complete silence. At this point, I was pretty freaked out and hoping that my girls hadn't woken up, but I wasn't that lucky because I could immediately hear talking from their tent and could tell that they were pretty scared. I was about to unzip my door and look out to see if maybe the boaters had had an accident or something when all of a sudden my whole tent lit up. The light slowly panned across me and onto the tent my girls were in. That immediately made them quiet. In a normal volume, though, I was able to tell them to stay absolutely still. The light panned back to my tent and then over to theirs again. I can only guess that it must have been some sort of a boat with a searchlight on it. If anyone has any ideas of what type of boat it could have been, please do let me know too. But after an eternity that was really only about 5 minutes, the light was turned off and I heard the motor engage and fade as the boat drove away from us. I immediately found the satellite phone and I called our camp director, who gave us the phone number for the local police. I called them and they said that they would forward the information that I gave to the local native detachment on Bear Island. I don't think any of us slept that night, and I got up at 5 in the morning to take my canoe out and take a look around. I thought that maybe somebody had fallen overboard and had managed to swim to shore or something. Obviously, I didn't find anyone. There was nothing floating in the water either, although it was a pretty deep body of water, I'll admit. But after that, none of us wanted to camp one more night there, so I called the camp and had them head out to pick up point a day early. And boy, did we paddle quickly that day and didn't really talk much. I think that none of us really wanted to speculate about what we might have heard and what could have happened if we'd made a noise or moved when the light was on our tents that night. I've also thought about this a lot over the years, but whenever I've told people the story, they've always been quite skeptical. I also recently started looking into missing person cases in the area, but not with much luck. If anyone is listening to this, though, and is familiar with Indigenous issues in Canada, they would know that there is a bit of an epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women, and these cases usually go unreported or unsolved. So some time ago, I just got in a loft bed. You know those black wooden ones from IKEA? Well, every night when I would go to sleep, I'd keep the TV on, which sat on my dresser across from the bed, because the noise would lull me to sleep, and I was sleeping in this loft bed. And well, that night, the noise and the light were keeping me up. Thanks, radiation. So I just decided to turn it off in the end. When I did, my bedroom was obviously pitch black, my door was closed, I didn't have any night lights on or anything, and there were no other devices in the room. I rolled over onto my side, facing towards the wall, and I closed my eyes. A few minutes went by, and I was still wide awake, I was beginning to get frustrated because I just couldn't fall asleep. And just as I was thinking about this, I just got the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. You know how you can just kind of tell that someone's walked into the room? Almost like the energy or the density changes or something. Well, I had an older sister who had a bad habit of creeping into my room late at night to steal my stuff, so I thought, okay, it's just Hannah getting something. But when I opened my eyes, my room was still dark and empty as far as I could tell. This told me that it wasn't her because whenever she'd come in, she'd leave the door open a crack and the hallway light would shine through. Plus, she's loud as hell, although she tried her best to be quiet so as to not wake me up. But my room was just absolutely silent. As soon as this realization dawned on me too, just an overwhelming sense of dread came over me. I knew that someone was in the room with me, just as I know my own name. But since the human mind needs tangible proof of everything, I decided to check just in case I was imagining it. If you know anything about loft beds though, you know that those things are loud as hell when you move since you're basically propped up on stilts in the air. So, as I moved, I tried to do so as quietly as possible so that whatever was in the room with me wasn't aware that I was there and knew that it was there too. When I finally reached the slats and looked down through them, sure enough, there was this black figure in the shape of a person standing in front of my dresser. I straight up knew that whatever this thing was, it was evil because A, malevolence practically oozed from it and spread over my bedroom, and B, this thing was literally blacker than the darkness of my bedroom. Like, imagine being in a pitch black room and then a figure materializes, no tangible features, just a straight up filled in outline in the shape of a person that is darker than the darkest night that you've ever experienced. That was this thing. I don't know how to, but as soon as I laid my eyes on this thing, I saw it turn its head and look at me. Again, it didn't have any features, so I didn't physically see its eyes looking at me, but it's almost like I could feel it in my mind. It paralyzed me, and then it began moving and walking towards my ladder like it was going to climb up. I shot straight up in terror, knowing that if this thing got to me, something bad was going to happen, and reached out my arm to turn on my ceiling fan light. Luckily, it was literally less than a foot away from where I was. I yelled out some sort of prayer or something as fast as I could, my mouth stumbling over the words in my haste, and as soon as I finished, I just felt this overwhelming sense of peace and love come over me like I've never felt before, as if something was truly there protecting me. When that feeling came over me too, all sense of just darkness and negativity just shattered. I was just so calm and at complete peace, almost like I'd taken a Xanax or something, although I didn't know what that feeling was until years later. And I just flicked the light back off and I instantly fell asleep again. I haven't seen a shadow person since then, but I do feel people and things standing near my bed at night all the time. It'll wake me up, but I'll never see anything. Whenever I feel like I'm not alone too, I'll imagine a white light just surrounding me and emanating from my body and tell whatever it is in my mind that it's not welcome and has to leave. And it works every single time, pretty much without fail. I know some of that could just be in my head, but the experience that I had when I was 13 absolutely terrified me, and I know that it was real, and I hope that it never happens again. This happened when I was maybe 9 to 10 years old, I think. I have a sister who's 8 years younger than me, so she was about a year to 2 years old at the time as well. During the summer months in Calgary, Canada, my family and another 3 to 4 families would frequently have barbecues out in Bowness Park. For those of you who are unfamiliar with this park, it's a really large park in Calgary that has a plethora of picnic areas, playgrounds, and fountain areas for kids to play in. The area is large, so you have a 5 to 10 minute walk between the playground and the picnic areas and bathrooms and whatnot, so often us kids would just leave the adults to go play in the fountains or the playgrounds, and it was generally safe enough that this never made any issues. I recall one time we went and we were playing in our little bathing suits when I see this tall guy with glasses and a large cowboy hat sitting on a bench just outside the fountain area, just watching us. I was a naive kid, never had any prior talks about stranger danger or any of that stuff, and his cowboy hat made me automatically assume that he was a park ranger. A couple of hours after leaving the fountains to eat and chill with the adults, my baby sister announced that she needed to use the bathroom. She was nearly potty trained at this point, but not completely. My mother asked me to take her to the bathrooms, which was about a 10-minute walk away. My friend who was about my age came along with me, and I just remember walking with them when a guy comes up to us and says hello and starts a conversation. He was wearing a cowboy hat, and I again assumed that he was just another park ranger. He was asking for our names and our ages and just overall had a very friendly demeanor. So, our idiotic selves talked openly with him. I did notice, though, that he had a particular interest in my baby sister, and at one point, even asked to hold her, but she was fussy and just wanted to walk. This went on until we reached the bathrooms, where we said goodbye to him and we went in. Now, this is when even my naive self started to feel like something was wrong. My sister ended up having an accident on herself, and I asked my friend to stay with her in the bathroom while I ran back to the picnic area to get a change of clothes from my mother. But when I stepped out of the bathroom, I found that same guy standing a couple of feet away from the bathroom, clearly waiting for something. And that was when my alarm bells started going off. So, I ran back to the picnic area and told my mum that I think some guy was following us, and she came with me to the bathroom, and when the guy saw me with my mother approaching from about 100 meters away, he just booked it, power walking in the opposite direction as fast as possible without attracting any attention from anyone nearby. At the time, I pretty much completely forgot about what happened. And it wasn't until a couple of years later that I suddenly realized that the man waiting for us outside the bathroom was the same man who had been watching us play in our bathing suits hours before this. And so, I can only assume that he'd been waiting for hours until we left the adults after we'd gone swimming to approach us. Also, that particular park did not have any park rangers. I don't really have any idea as to exactly what his true intentions were, but I'm pretty sure that they were not good. So, I work in a group home for the developmentally disabled, and my usual shifts are the overnights, which begin at 11 p.m. and end at 9 a.m. the next day. And oh boy, let me tell you that this place is haunted. I've been working here for a solid 6 months now, and some really strange things have happened. In the first few months, 4.5 to be precise, nobody lived in the basement apartment of the home, and whenever you go down there, it's really creepy. Also, to mention, this is a finished furnished basement apartment with its own kitchen, living room, bathroom, and bedroom, meant to house clients that book for a certain amount of time. Whenever it's empty though, it just always sounds like something is down there, whether it be a person talking or walking or hearing the doors close or stuff like that. As a result, I keep the door connecting the basement to the top floor locked, but that doesn't stop whatever is down there. One night, as I was awake, I could hear solid heavy footsteps make their way up the stairs to the top, and then I hear the door handle try to turn, which almost put me into an anxiety attack, I'll admit, and led me to texting my coworker, who didn't help at all as she began sharing her own experiences with the house that have been very similar to mine. After the 4.5 months since I started working, we have a client who permanently moved into the basement. Best thing to ever happen too. And why? Because we just chalk up all the noises to them now. However, the one shift I was working, they asked if I could go downstairs and help them, and I went downstairs and we got to talking, and they mentioned how sometimes that they think the basement is haunted. And I mean, what, right? They mentioned how they sometimes hear them walking around, and how one night they heard someone turn on the lamp in the living room. They heard the click of the string being pulled. Another incident too is when the client wasn't home, and due to certain policies and whatnot, we keep cameras in the upstairs and downstairs apartments in the living rooms. I was on the phone with my boss as the upstairs camera stopped working, and they were just guiding me through on how to reset it. While waiting for it to boot up, they checked the camera downstairs and asked me to do a quick check on the client. I informed them, though, that the client wasn't home, and my boss then said that they could hear walking and somebody coughing down there. I can tell you right now that it was none of the clients upstairs, as they were sitting down on the couch the entire time watching TV, and none of them had coughed. So I quickly go downstairs with my boss on the phone, and as I said, there was no one down there. It was completely insane, but the next thing to recently happen was the little black cubed alarm clock that we have. This alarm clock that we have upstairs to go off at 6 p.m. to remind staff that it's bedtime. Well, on my overnights, I'm just laying in the dark while on my phone just browsing through social media, when the radio of the clock just turns on out of nowhere. The volume slowly goes up, then quickly goes down and then just shuts off again. And after that, you can bet your bottom dollar that I unplugged that shit. It's in a separate room now, and I'm just done with all of these overnights. I was 10 years old. I lived in a relatively small town in Texas, in a small house with my mum. My mum has always had a very caring heart for those in need, so when my uncle called her one night and told her that he ran into a homeless girl at the local park, my mum offered to help her out for the day, or so that she could just get back on her feet, that sort of thing. When the girl arrived at my house, she said that her name was Laura. Laura told us that she was 16 at the time. She seemed like a bit of a shy girl. When my mother asked what she was doing out on the streets, Laura told us that she'd been kicked out by her mum because her mum had accused her of sleeping with her boyfriend or something. Laura told us that the allegation was not true. She told us that her mother's boyfriend was the one who came onto her, and my mum gave Laura a place to sleep in the guest bedroom that night. The next day, after breakfast, Laura asked to use my mum's house phone to call her mum to see if she could get some of her things from her mum's house. Laura's mum never answered the phone, and we just honestly felt bad for her. I mean, as a 10-year-old girl, I just couldn't imagine what she was going through. Later that day, I remember watching TV in the living room and just minding my own business, but I could feel someone staring at me, so I turned my head where I felt the gaze. It was sending me a glare so cold that if looks could kill, I would have dropped dead. I was confused and honestly a little bit startled. I turned my head away from her quickly and I just went back to watching TV, but I could still feel Laura's cold gaze. I couldn't understand what I'd done to her to cause her to look at me with such hate. And the next day, it happened once more. I was in the kitchen getting a glass of water when I could just feel someone looking at me. I turned my head to the side and I saw Laura's head peering around the corner at me. Her eyes were dark and just laced with hatred. It frightened me and I felt so confused as to why she was looking at me like this. I didn't want to cause any trouble though, so I didn't bring up Laura's death glares to my mother at all. Later that night, my uncle had joined us for dinner. He had stopped by to see how everything was with Laura and if we had any luck finding her a place to live with one of her family members. After dinner, I was washing my plate in the sink when I heard a loud growling sound coming from the dining room. I turned my head to see Laura shaking and growling like some sort of wild animal. My mum and uncle looked disturbed and worried. Laura threw herself into the floor and began thrashing around and screaming as if she were possessed or something. I was obviously absolutely terrified. It was truly a scary thing to witness. I mean, I grew up very religious, and my mum and uncle began praying out loud for Laura while I ran to my room and I just closed the door. And this went on for 2 whole hours, but it honestly felt like forever. I could hear Laura screaming like a madwoman and growling like just some sort of a deranged animal. I don't think any of us knew exactly what the hell was going on. After my mum and uncle had prayed for Laura for what felt like forever, Laura told us that she was free from an evil demon that had taken over her. None of us are sure what had actually caused her behavior. None of us are sure what even happened that night. But I remember peeking my head out of the room to see Laura just smiling happily while she curled up on the couch with a blanket. But her eyes opened and she shot a cold glare at me, and I quickly closed my bedroom door just in fear. I also placed a chair in front of my bedroom door that night and I went to sleep. I woke up the next morning by my mum waking me up, and she told me that she was taking me out to eat at my favourite restaurant. When I asked her if Laura was going, she gave me a serious expression and she spoke. "Honey, your uncle's going to take Laura back to her mum's house. He slept on the couch last night after what happened. He and I were talking when the two of you had gone to sleep, and we pieced together that Laura made the entire performance up last night," she said. She's not stable, sweetheart, and we think that she might be dangerous." As I heard my mother say those words, relief just washed over me. I got dressed quickly and I went to the car to go to the restaurant with my mum. When we got into the car, we saw Laura and my uncle getting into his truck with her, and Laura, man, she looked angry. Her expression was just honestly of a child when you don't give them what they want. They got into my uncle's car though, and they just drove away. I'm 22 now, and I've never forgotten about this horrific incident that happened in my life years ago. And after that day, I never saw Laura or heard anything else about her ever again. So 12 years ago, my grandmother slipped into dementia. She was 90 at the time, so it wasn't a horrible surprise, but still hard, you know. We moved her from her apartment that she owned in Las Vegas to a care facility close to our home, about 20 minutes outside of Vegas, I think. Which meant that we actually rented out her apartment to what at the time seemed like a really nice guy. Him and his wife were actually mid-divorce though, and she fled back to her hometown in the Bahamas or something. He paid his rent religiously too, until, well, he just didn't. My father tried reaching out, but there was no response. Finally, he asked my brother and I to stop by the apartment to see what was up. We knocked on the door and he answers, and he looks really disheveled and just looked off. My brother asks if everything was okay, and he just kind of stared at us and didn't answer right away. Finally, he snapped out of it, and then he invited us in. My brother asked for the check and told him that we were on our way somewhere. He kept saying that I can write you a check, but come inside so I can write it. My brother forcefully asked again for the check, and I guess he realized at this point that we weren't going to come in. He looked just really sickly though, and he told my brother that he'd been having some chest pain. My brother told him to go to the doctors or call an ambulance, and he finally gave us the check and then asked one more time for us to just come on inside. We got the hell out of there though, and we gave my dad the check later that night. Now, 3 days later, Metro Police called my dad late at night. He was my grandma's power of attorney and was listed on the lease. They'd done a wellness check and they actually saw a body laying on the floor. And it was our tenant, who, when they gained access to his apartment, they also found a woman's body in the bathroom. Later, they discovered that he'd had a heart attack after he killed her. They never went into detail how she was murdered, and my folks had to call in a crime scene cleaning company to clean it all up. But my brother and I were completely stunned that he most likely murdered her after we came to collect the check, but he also could have killed her before then. Either way, why did he want us to come inside? If you look up Kadena Air Base in Okinawa, you'll find a lot of stories about hauntings and paranormal activity happening around that base. My whole family, aside from my dad, who was rarely home, experienced really odd and paranormal things in our house, and we were told stories from our neighbours as well. I was a really young kid when we lived there, 6 or 8 I think, but my memory is fairly clear about some of the things that happened to me. When we lived there, we would tell my mum about all the experiences that we were having, and she would just dismiss them. Finally, when we moved away, She told us her own experiences and said that she didn't want to scare us at the time. And I thought that I should finally share these since it's been a long time. They're going to be a bit jumbled and disorganized, so sorry about that, but it's the best that I can do. So firstly, I had a neighbor girl that I was friends with who told me that she could speak to other girls through the air conditioning vents, and she would drop coins and like little keychains down into the ducts for them. Along those same lines, my older sister once saw a black gooey mass ooze from one of the vents at the neighbor's house that she was babysitting for just come out of it. The girls she watched also had loud conversations in their bedrooms and would play with their friends in the walls during their bedtime. Now, I was playing with dolls once in my shared bedroom with the door shut. I remember the doorknob kept twisting and opening every few minutes, and I just told it to stop, and it did. On another occasion, I noticed one of my stuffed animals missing, and my mum has thrown it away, I thought. And apparently, I had actually told my mum that the plush was whispering to me, and I wasn't sleeping because of it. I don't remember any of that, though, but I trust my mum, and I believe she's telling the truth. My older sister and I shared a bedroom with bunk beds too, but we both slept in the bottom bunk together because there was just an odd presence to the top bunk that really creeped us both out. We all expressed feeling extremely uncomfortable walking up or down the stairs, like something was always watching us. Even my mum admitted to sprinting up and down them and constantly checking behind her for eyes and whatnot. My little sister had her own bedroom, and her toys would constantly go off at night, even if they were turned off. My mum also told us once, when we were older, that my toddler sister and her were lying down for a nap, and she heard someone in the room say, "I love you, Mummy." Confused, my mum said, "I love you too." But my sister said, "Who was that?" or something along those lines. And my older sister and I were playing at a friend's house at the time, so it was weird, but there was nobody else in that room. But we have a ton of stories and lots from neighbours too, but I just wanted to share these ones because they were definitely the strangest and the creepiest. Thanks for listening. Oh, and if anybody else has any experiences while living on a base, I would sure love to see them in the comments below. This occurred in 2009. I was 22 years old and was leaving my home state of California to head east for my corrections job. I was driving down the loneliest highway portion of the route, and it was around 3 a.m. on a Sunday. They don't call it the loneliest highway for nothing, too. I mean, I hadn't seen another soul for at least a half hour. I was getting sleepy, but I wasn't tired enough to pull over and take a nap or anything, when I saw a broken down car on the side of the highway. I slowed, and I saw a woman standing next to the car. I approached this woman with caution, rolling down my window just a sliver, because something about her just wasn't right. I couldn't put my finger on it then, but I know now that it was my subconscious just screaming red flag. But I asked her if she needed me to call a tow truck or AAA for her or something, and she immediately tried to open my door. I explained to her that I didn't feel comfortable letting her in, but I'd wait until a tow truck came. She immediately got this look of rage on her face, started berating me. "You're a big man, what am I going to do to you?" saying I was cruel for not letting her in. And this is where I messed up. I can see it now, 10 years later. I begrudgingly unlocked my door, figuring that she's right. She at most is 5'2", and I'm over 6 feet and have 100 pounds over her. She looked to be about 90 or so pounds, but she slips in and I ask her, who can I call? This was 10 years ago, so I had a little BlackBerry Slide, I think, at the time. She starts telling me that she'd just prefer if I'd give her a ride to the next town. Now I'm starting to realize that I've messed up because she's avoiding eye contact and she's fumbling in her purse, and when I mention calling for help, she's getting aggressive, demanding that I take her to the next town. I'm so busy trying to untangle this situation that I miss a man who either was hiding in or near her car, and it wasn't until he was almost to my driver's side door that I managed to catch him in my rearview mirror. Flight or fight kicked in, and I put my car in drive and sped off right as the fucker was reaching for my car door. I sped off, and I heard a ping noise, and then my rearview mirror exploding. because he was shooting at me. The adrenaline alone had me doing near 90, and by this time, Homegirl realized in whatever drug-induced stupor that she was in, her little plan was futile. She started hitting me and telling me to stop and let her out, and when I reached enough of a distance, I did just that. Pulled over and demanded that she get the hell out. She started going for the oversized purse that she had, but I had enough, and I was literally shaking with adrenaline. I reached over, opened the door, and just pretty much kicked her out. I tried grabbing for her purse, but she managed to hold on to it, not before dumping half of what was in it there on the passenger seat. I sped off, my door still open. I waited until I got a good distance from her and slammed it shut and locked it. I then clenched the wheel and drove, if on something autopilot. It wasn't until later that morning, too, that I pulled into a Denny's did I realize just how close I was to pretty much dying that night. I had a good cry, and then I realized a bunch of her things spilled onto my passenger seat. Most of it was just nasty watered-up napkins, a few tubes of lipstick, and drug paraphernalia. I had considered calling the cops or finding a highway patrol officer or something, and I did something stupid. I tossed all of her things that had fallen into a trash bag and just threw them away. At the time, I had the dream of becoming a cop and knew if I got caught with drug paraphernalia that would be impossible. I didn't think that they would believe me that the drug paraphernalia wasn't mine. I noticed a cop at the gas station across from Denny's, and I told him what happened. He pretty much berated me for pulling over and then letting her in like that. He did say that he'd look into it, but I doubt that he did. I was so shaken up that I pretty much picked up my pancakes and then just left to continue on my way. I never did replace that mirror, and I ended up selling my car as where I lived didn't require me to have one. Until this day, 10 years later, I hesitate to stop and help stranded motorists because of that night. About 2 years back, I experienced something that gave me chills to this day whenever I think about it. I had to submit a short film for my exam. We were short on time, so we had to shoot during our Eid holidays. It was the last day of our holidays and our last shoot day as well. We went to our location, which was actually my friend's house, and we had to set up our scene at the rooftop. Since we were really rookie, there was no big crew, lots of lights and stuff, just a few friends trying to get their work done. When we got there, it was after 12 at night. We were setting up our stuff. Our friend, whose place it was, wasn't with us. We're keeping check on the batteries, the cards and stuff beforehand. The shoot is an understood practice. But when we turned on our cameras, both of them ran out of batteries, which was really strange. But no one said anything, and we put them on charge since we had some time spare, and after a while, when the batteries were just enough to work with, we set up our scene. The terrace that we were on had merely 2 feet distance from the terrace of the house beside it, but one wall of that place was completely covered with dense plants and leaves, and when we started shooting our scene, we noticed after a while that 3 kids are standing on that terrace just watching us. That wasn't really too unusual for us, since people do notice you when you take out your cameras. Then we got busy in our work, and then I looked at my left to see if those kids are still there, subconscious action, and they weren't there. And after that, I just got busy into the work again. When we were done with our shoot, it was probably around 2:30 a.m. I think, but those kids were there again, and their formation was the girl, about 8 or 9, was on the right, a boy, about 6 or 7 in the middle, and another boy, about 3 or 4 on the left. But the really strange thing was that all 3 of them were completely bald. One of my friends got suspicious and asked the kids, "Hey, kids, where's your parents?" The middle one replied, "I don't know, maybe they're having dinner." My friend called me to come closer, showed me their house, and asked me, "Are they having a candlelight dinner at this house or something? Why the hell is it completely dark?" I got a bit nervous at that. Another friend of mine asked them, "So, where did you guys come from?" And that girl replied with a word that is really rare in our language that only 2 of my friends knew the meaning. And what she said meant, "We are prisoners." We really didn't know what the hell that meant at that moment, but our friend just told us to not communicate with those kids anymore. So we went down and called our friend to say that we're free now and he should open the garage so that we can take our cars out. And when he came out, we asked him, who were those kids? And he said, what kids? No one lives in that house. I was really nervous, so I shouted, dude, that's not funny at all. He got kind of angry and said, come. Now, that house had 2 gates and he showed us both and said, look at that. And I cannot put into words what kind of spine-chilling feel that I had right at that moment when I saw those 2 giant padlocks. And then he told us that there used to be a mental asylum, NGO type, in this very house many, many years ago. And that was the last time that I ever went there. So I'm a 24 female that absolutely fell in love with national parks. So much so that I decided to work full-time at one for about 3 years, in fact. This experience allowed me to meet some genuinely great people, but it also welcomed some just really sketchy individuals too. So this particular story starts with a man that we'll call Sam. Sam was a tall man with a shaved head and glasses. He was the kind of co-worker that would always just kind of linger awkwardly. He made everyone feel uncomfortable, but not enough to warrant any concern or anything. But the only issue that I really noticed was that he seemed like he had a drinking problem or something. He would show up to work still drunk and be sent home somewhat regularly. He seemed innocent enough, though, in a sort of socially awkward way. But I only worked with him for a few months before I was transferred to another location anyway, and was offered a pay rise. Now, a few months after starting the new position, I was in the employee break room just browsing my newsfeed when I received 5 messages within a 3-minute time span. I didn't even realize people could type that fast, but the messages, they were from Sam. It was something that caught me off guard too, because I'd never really spoken to him outside of my last position. The messages consisted of vague threats regarding my friends and myself, and he seemed upset to find out that I had gay friends and thought that I was tainted from association. I was less upset at his foul perception of me, and honestly, more pissed that he had targeted my friends, who were truly lovely people. I'm bad when it comes to taking the high road, so I decided to give this man a piece of my mind too. We weren't friends, hardly acquaintances in fact, so I didn't feel that his behavior was appropriate, and quite frankly I was pretty pissed. Through our exchange, the original rude context of the messages became obviously threatening too. He told me that I should die along with my gay friends and that he'd be more than happy to end our misery. And needless to say, I was pretty shocked by this. His anger just didn't make sense to me, and I realized that I wasn't going to reason with this lunatic, so I decided to get HR involved. We work with the same company, so I thought that this would be the best route to prevent any further harassment. HR advised me to just block contact with him while they investigated, but to also alert authorities in case he decided to act out his threats. Authorities were also involved now, but they didn't seem too fazed by the messages that I had shown them. They almost seemed annoyed that I had even bothered calling them in the first place, but I filled out a statement and was told to contact them if anything progressed. And the very next day, I woke up to find trash just all over my front steps. Odd, but not too strange, I suppose. I actually thought it was a raccoon since I was in the national park. But then I saw a piece of paper with the words, "Watch your back, bitch," scribbled into it. I looked around the other neighboring cabins to see if anyone was watching, but I didn't see anyone. So I just cleaned up the mess, but I saved the note. I wanted to show my sister who lived with me, and when she got back home later that morning, I caught her up on the previous night's events. She didn't even know Sam because, like I said, we were not friends. But why would I mention him in my personal life? But I gave her a brief description of the guy in case she saw him lurking around or something, and then I headed to work. Now, halfway through my shift, I get a phone call from Alexa. She sounds shaken when she tells me, too, that a man matching Sam's description came to our cabin and asked about me and where I was. She played dumb and pretended not to even know who I was. After an awkward silence, too, he said, "I'll be back to get her later," and just walked away. She said that he sounded and acted like he'd been heavily drinking and had an intense coldness to him like she'd never seen before. And at this stage, I'm not messing around anymore, and I've watched enough crime shows to know that you shouldn't underestimate people like this. So I called the company's security team and I asked to have someone check on my sister and to be escorted home just immediately. I'm home within 20 minutes of her phone call. She gave security some information and they were able to find out which cabin he resided in. And apparently, he only lived about a 2-minute walk down our street, which was really unnerving. Park rangers are called again and they get some statements from both of us and decide to pay him a visit. And at least they seem to be taking the situation a bit more seriously now that he knows where I live. They come back after talking to his roommate. It's confirmed that he lives there but hasn't been home since the night before. Authorities put a word out to keep an eye out for Sam. They offer to have a unit keep an eye on us tonight as well, which we gladly accept, and we just go to bed. Eventually I wake up to 34 messages from an unknown number. And you guessed it. It was Sam again. He was very angry that I got HR and Rangers involved, and he said, "You're going to pay for this, you bitch. You messed with the wrong person. I'll end you." I email HR and present them with the screenshots of the messages and the texts. I demand that they resolve this immediately and want to set up a meeting with the director to discuss termination. See, in national parks when you're hired, the company provides cheap housing on site. And when you're fired, you have to leave the national park boundary within 24 hours. And so I thought that this would solve a majority of the issues. But they seem to agree with me and try to locate Sam for a meeting, and no one has seen him since the first messages began 2 days prior, so the park is basically on a manhunt now. The park is huge though, and it's easy to hide in if you don't want to be found. Thankfully though, his roommate alerted officials when Sam stumbled home drunk the next day. But they were able to speak with him and sober him up enough to take him to the HR building a couple of hours later. After the meeting, I'm notified that he's given a first and final write-up and will continue to work and live on my street. He apparently gave some sort of a sob story about his personal issues and promises to leave me alone and stuff. I was completely baffled that even with him threatening to kill me, that they weren't going to fire him. Thankfully, the Rangers were equally surprised and still offered to provide surveillance just in case. It was quiet for 3 days too, and honestly, I thought that it was actually over and started to feel bad for Sam actually. I thought maybe he was honestly going through some stuff and I was just his mental punching bag or something. I didn't agree with it obviously, but I no longer felt as threatened, if that makes sense. That was until I received a knock on my door and opened it to find 2 Rangers wanting to speak with me. According to the Rangers and a few people from the HR department, Sam's roommate had called the emergency line when Sam started acting bizarre after the meeting and tried to convince him to lure me to a secluded place so Sam could take care of me. Thankfully, his roommate wasn't a psycho and reported the situation immediately once Sam went to the bathroom. Rangers were on site within minutes and had restrained Sam in order to search their cabin for evidence. And they ended up finding a loaded firearm and a suspected suicide note that stated that he was going to kill me and then take his own life. There was now plenty of evidence for a case, and he was successfully banned from all national parks in the US. I have since moved to a different state and have changed my contact information. He has since contacted me once to brag about how much I helped him secure unemployment benefits, which I quickly shared with officials. According to officials, he's restricted to a southern AZ county due to other crimes that he later committed and that I shouldn't worry about him finding me. As for HR, the director actually had to deal with harassment from Sam, after the banning that is, and asked me to testify on her behalf if it turned into something more sinister. I haven't heard anything since, so I'm assuming that she found another way to stop his assault. I still really don't understand why he decided to target me of all people. But we hadn't had very many interactions, even at work, and I've tried to dig through memories to find a single time that I may have invited this kind of behaviour, but I'm convinced that it was due to many factors, obviously including his instability and alcoholism. Either way, everything turned out safe in the end, but it was a wild ride, to say the least. So my father was in the army for 21 years, retired, and moved to a very small town in central Florida. He got bored after a couple of years, and even though he didn't need the money, between his retirement and what my mum was making as a bookkeeper and tax prep, he wanted to go back to work. He started working at various gas stations, and it being a small town, the owners wouldn't care if I came there and helped out with the stocking and the coolers, or even running the register, as long as I just didn't sell any beer or smokes. But this all took place in the late 80s and early 90s as well. Now, the actual story I'm going to tell took place in 1990, and I remember the date well because it was shortly after my birthday, and being 15 in Florida, I had just gotten my learner's permit, and my dad let me drive him to and from work, just to get some experience on the road, both at day and at night. So I was sitting in my usual spot at the table that was set up along the windows, book in hand, feet propped up, and a Mountain Dew on the table along with some snacks. I would generally spend most of the evening that way too, just reading books, getting up to run to the register and stock the cooler at different times, and just stuff like that. I remember glancing up too because something caught my attention that was a bit unusual, and I realized that a lady was walking up our parking lot from the direction of the interstate, the gas station that was right on I-75. This in and of itself was really strange because where we were located, you didn't get many people just walking in like this, and definitely not walking from the direction of the interstate. I figured that she must have broken down somewhere though, and was just coming to use the phone to call for a tow truck or something. But boy, I was completely wrong. She came into the store and just looked around for a few minutes, and I remember getting just a strange and really creepy feeling about her. She walked up to the counter and started telling my dad a story about how she had gotten stranded and needed a ride up to the next big town up north from us. Osala was the town, and this is pretty important. My dad lets her know that he's working and there's just no way that he can take her. She turns and looks at me, and while she's looking away from him, my dad catches my eye and subtly shakes his head no. I was confused for a second, but then she turns back to my dad and points at me, asking if I can take her. My dad responded back that I only had a learner's permit and wouldn't be able to drive her anyway and then drive back. But normally, I would have done it, even though it was illegal because I'd done it a few times before already, in fact. I didn't argue with my dad though, since this was completely out of character for him. I mean, he was normally chatty with the customers, but for whatever reason, he was just almost curt and dismissive of her. Turns out that he had a bad vibe about her from the minute that he had seen her walking up the drive. And well, she cusses him for a minute, and he basically tells her to get out of the store. She slammed the door open, and I thought the glass was about to break from how hard she had slammed it. And then she just stalks out of the store and down the driveway. I keep an eye on her and continue to watch as she makes her way back up to the interstate, and then just starts up the northbound on the ramp. Almost a year passes, and I'm in my bedroom, less than a week before my 16th birthday. I hear my dad yelling from the living room, "Son, get your ass in here now and look at this." I quickly run to the living room, and I see my dad pointing at the TV, and I look at the mugshot of the lady on the screen, and immediately remember the lady who had been in the store that night. Turns out that I almost gave a car ride to Eileen Warners, who was later convicted of being a serial murderer and then later put to death. So first, here's a little bit of information. This story goes back a couple of years now, and I was 14 and my sister was 20. My sister had an apartment in the city centre of one of the largest cities of the country that we lived in, and the city is really well known for its high drugs and crime rates and so on. So this experience is definitely not uncommon, however, still very scary. My school was only one train stop away, so I would stay at her place a lot. I lived about 6 stops away. My school was in a really bad neighborhood too, and was for kids that couldn't stay in normal schools. Think of like drug abusers, drug dealers, criminals, etc. So I strategically picked my friends so I wouldn't have any problems, and if I did, I would at least be protected. Also, I've never joined or been born into a gang, but my 2 best friends, they and their families were. So, this is where it started. Because of said affiliations with gangs, I never hung out with my friends after school because it just simply wasn't safe to be seen with them. That is, until I did one day, and it was the biggest mistake that I have ever made. After years of being great friends at school, we thought it would be okay to start hanging out at my sister's place, and it was all fine. I figured that if I didn't mess with drugs or gangs, then I'd never be in contact with them anyway. Spoiler alert too, I was very wrong. Now one day I went to school, but found out that it was closed because of a holiday, so I decided to drop by my friend unannounced. And I immediately realized that that was not a good idea when I witnessed his dad and some others do something that I shouldn't have seen. So I ran to my sister's home and I called in sick from school the next 3 days or so. We figured that calling the police just wasn't an option, but nothing happened after I witnessed it, so the next week I just went back to school. My best friend wasn't there, but that was normal because that kid skipped class so many times it would be weirder if he did actually attend school. And quite honestly, everything seemed pretty normal, so my sister and I didn't really worry about it too much. So one night, later that week, at around 2 a.m, we hear someone trying to break in. So we flickered the lights and our dog started barking. Like I said before, it was in the city centre in a high crime city, so she had break-in attempts before or drunk people messing against a door every few days. So at this point, we knew the drill. Making sounds and showing them that there's people home usually does the job. But not this time. At this point, my sister was calling the police and I was slamming cooking trays together, like screaming like a lunatic. Much like the I ain't never getting sleep because of y'all vine, and they just didn't go away. So the police said that they were sending someone. Now, we could see somebody's arm with a black shirt and gloves with a crowbar opening the window, and the dispatcher told us to go and hide in the bathroom or a place with a lock in it. This apartment was weirdly built in a way where you had the sleeping quarters, the living room and the kitchen room, and then a door to a walk-in closet, and at the back of the closet was the door to the bathroom. It was like some sort of Narnia shit if I'm being honest. Anyway, we hid in the bathroom and we could hear that the person was now inside of our house, and they ran off once they heard the sirens. The dispatcher said that the police had arrived, and when she said that we sent someone, we didn't expect to see 3 cars, 4 motors, and officers just everywhere. But they never caught the guy, and the police told us to watch out because this just definitely wasn't a normal break-in. They explained to us that when things like this happen, it's most likely a homicide attempt, and we had to go to the station to do the whole questioning thing. We explained everything, and the police said that it wasn't safe for us to go back, so we just never did. We got a temporary apartment to stay in while the investigation was still going on. We stayed there for about 2 weeks, and thank God that we did because the day after we moved out, the apartment was burned to nothing but ashes. After investigating, they could see that it was purposely set on fire with the intent of actually burning the place down. This was actually ruled a second homicide attempt in 2 weeks, and we got help with moving to the other side of the country, and we're not using our full real names ever again. Thankfully, nothing related to this has happened since then, but we're definitely keeping an eye out. About 5 years ago, my wife and I went on a weekend camping trip with our 2 closest friends, another married couple. The campsite is just outside of Yosemite and absolutely beautiful. The beauty of it, and the creepiness of it, I suppose, is that you take a dirt road for about an hour and a half, I think, off the main road to get to it. It's extremely secluded, in other words, but never really felt threatening. It's a really popular campsite, so there were always people around, especially in the summer too, when this actually occurred. So the first day was pretty much awesome. I don't remember exactly what we did, but I remember having a great time. The campsites are all fairly close together and usually separated by various shrubs, etc. I remember too that we were all pretty pumped about the site that we got, as there were no neighbours on one side, just forest, and no one occupying the site closest to us. This is pretty uncommon here too, as these campgrounds stay fully booked throughout the summer. Day 2 started normally as well. We had breakfast, then we headed to the lake for a couple of hours. The lake was about a 20-minute hike from the main campground, and when we got back around 2ish I think it was, we noticed that the site next to us now had a silver rental car parked on it. Well, we didn't think much of it, and we just went about making a fire to cook with. At some point, we noticed the occupant of the site next to us, a pretty average-looking white dude, maybe early 40s. And honestly, he was just so average-looking that it's hard to even picture him. We all immediately caught to the fact, though, that he was just constantly looking over at us. My friend Dave even made a comment to me under his breath, like, "You notice this guy keeps looking over here?" I remember feeling a little bit uncomfortable about that too, because we were still in our bathing suits from the lake, but I made a conscious effort to just ignore it. It's probably worth mentioning too that we were a little buzzed or drunk. Not out of control or anything, but just feeling pretty good. Now, throughout the afternoon and into the evening, we continued to notice this guy just constantly looking over at us. In hindsight, Dave, or I should have called him out for it. And I mean, this story doesn't make us look great, but whatever. I had been stressed at work prior to this trip, and I really didn't want to let some creepy dude throw off the relaxed vibe that we had. Stupid, I know, but that's what I was thinking. The alcohol, coupled with the fact that we honestly kind of felt bad for him, led to us to not confront him. Yes, it was very creepy, but I just told myself that he was just an awkward, lonely dude. Aside from the staring, though, there were a couple of mildly weird incidences that occurred leading up to the very weird stuff. The first was that, at some point, he left his site to go and do whatever, and while he was gone, a girl, probably in her mid-20s, our age basically, walked by and snapped a picture of his license plate. I remember asking her if she needed anything, and she smiled awkwardly and just kept walking. Dave and I both thought that was really odd, but were preoccupied with beer. Later into the evening, around 7ish, the camp host was doing her rounds checking people in, and she checked us in and moved on to him. I remember us all eavesdropping intently to hear what they were saying too. I think we just wanted to hear what this creep sounded like, and he kept asking questions about the bathhouse. We didn't even know that there was a bathhouse, or even what a bathhouse was, but he had at least 100 different questions about it. Where is it? How late is it open? Is it private? Maybe not that weird, I suppose, but in context, it's definitely odd. So the sun started to go down, and we were all drunk by now, so we weren't too concerned with creepy dude anymore. At one point, we went for a walk, and we noticed him snooping around what we believed to be the bathhouse. And now I would call out this kind of behavior, but again, I was drunk and 5 years stupider at the time. We all laughed and just talked about how creepy he was. Back at the site, we continued to drink and have a good time. Now, at one point, the guy just started eating beans really aggressively out of a can in the light of his single lantern, no fire. He looked at us while doing it, and Dave and I just kind of snickered to each other at how weird it was. I don't think the girls noticed, but eventually we just decided to go to bed. I think the guy had actually left his side at this point. I kind of remember us making jokes like, "I better not wake up to that dude looking in our window, ha ha ha." But anyway, my wife and I slept in our SUV with the seats folded down. Dave and Sarah slept in the camper shell of their truck, and I remember feeling a little creeped out as I fell asleep, but I shrugged it off. But at around 2:30 in the morning, both my wife and I were jolted awake by what we thought was a woman's scream. We both looked at each other and asked if the other had heard that. We came to the conclusion that it was probably just people at some other site being loud or something, and we decided to just go back to sleep. But as I was trying to go back to sleep, I just started feeling really unsettled. I decided to get out of my car and just go and take a look around. I cracked my door open, trying to be as quiet as possible. I had gotten about one leg out of the car when I heard faint but direct whispering coming from Dave and Sarah's camper shell about 4 feet away. I froze, and then I heard it again. I eventually realized that they were trying to tell me something. I whispered back, "What?" I then very clearly heard Dave say, "Start your car." I instantly realized that something was very wrong. So, rather than ask any questions, I climbed back into my car to start it. Right away, Dave and Sarah bursted out of the back of the camper and frantically jumped into my car, and they told me to drive. They were too freaked out to explain anything at that point, so I just kind of drove off aimlessly. Eventually, though, I pulled over, figuring that we were far enough away from whatever had freaked them out. And finally, Sarah calmed down enough to tell us what happened. So as she put it, she was woken up by a light coming from Creepy Dude's campsite. And apparently, he had set up lanterns and flashlights to spotlight himself, completely naked, masturbating in the direction of our cars. She also mentioned that he was flaccid and not able to finish. A gross detail, but I feel like it's important, because it gets weirder. At some point, he stopped and turned off the lights and began using a flashlight to signal across a small ravine that the campsite's backed up to. And I'm talking like Morse code kind of thing or something. Across the ravine, an old RV began using its headlights to signal back too. Dave was awake by this point. I questioned them on this detail, and they both said that it was very clear that they were communicating. And after that, he turned off his light. Keep in mind, it is absolutely pitch black out there at night. And after a few minutes, they heard footsteps around their car, followed by a hard tap on the window. And that is what caused Sarah to scream, hence waking me up. And yes, at this point, I decided that we needed to call the police. The problem was, there was absolutely zero cell service at the campsite. Furthermore, it was at least an hour and a half up a service road from what was already a very remote part of the state, so leaving at night wasn't really an option. We decided the best course of action was just to alert the camp host. We drove around and eventually found the trailer that she lived in. She was understandably confused to be woken up at 3:30 in the morning, but was very responsive to her credit. She mentioned too that the guy was really weird when she checked him in, and called the police on her satellite phone. Apparently there was a massive wildfire burning that weekend, and the police said that they wouldn't be able to send anyone out until sunrise. And so the camp host basically said that there wasn't really anything that she could do beyond calling the police. It really sucked hearing that. I mean, basically, we were stuck in our car in the pitch blackness while some crazy masturbating dude was just out and about, and not to mention whoever was in that RV as well. But one more really weird thing happened that I think I should mention. At around 4 in the morning, we were all sitting in my car when a man in a hood just walked right up to the window. The second I noticed him too, I turned my engine and the headlights on. He immediately ran off into the trees, and we just kind of sat there in my car until sunrise. But once it was light out, we went back to the site to pack up our things. His car was still there, with blankets hung in all the windows. The whole thing just felt really gross, and we wanted to get the hell out of there, so we quickly packed up and we just left. A couple of hours after we left too, I actually got a call from the police. They said that they went out to the campsite and they actually questioned the guy, and he said that he was simply showering. The cop told me that there was nothing that he could do. It was our word against his, basically. He also questioned the people in the RV, and they said that they didn't know what he was talking about, but mentioned that, and I quote, "a very rude camper screamed in the middle of the night." In the end, the whole experience with the police was just really frustrating. I tried following up. I even tried getting help from a family member who's a sheriff, but even he said that there just wasn't anything that they could do, unless that particular police chief really wanted to investigate this guy. And so in the end, that's pretty much the story. I learned a lesson, though, about being polite when someone is making you feel uncomfortable. Nowadays, I'm much more aggressive with creepy people. I also know that it's easy to hear this story and wonder why Dave or myself didn't just confront the guy, especially when he's literally masturbating at the car you're sleeping in. But I don't know. I wish we would have showed more courage, but honestly, it was just really scary in the moment. I'm okay with admitting that as well. Nowadays, I think it's kind of funny, in fact, just how stupid we were and how bizarre the whole situation was. I also feel fortunate that nobody was hurt. Clearly, though, we were dealing with a very messed up individual who definitely had accomplices. And I can only imagine what their end goal was, and what they could have been capable of doing. I also think that they had done stuff like this before because the whole thing just seemed really orchestrated. And man, do I really wish that the police could have done something that night. I work at the Winchester Mystery House, which means that I hear a lot of stories. I'm really not the type of person to delve much into the paranormal, but I've definitely seen a few things myself that aren't easy to explain. I'd like to hear what things other people have seen too. Then maybe I can check it out myself. I've been at the house past midnight more than a few times as well. I'll start sharing though. Hopefully guests and other workers will share, and I'll keep updating as I see or hear more things. Also, I'm really not one to dramatize things, so I apologize if this doesn't have added excitement or anything. I just want to report what I've experienced and see what other people have seen or even heard. So, somewhere in the house during the current Halloween-themed Unhinged, I won't say where right now since I don't have to give away the scene, but there's a motion sensor. When the people pass it, I was coming back from break, 10 p.m. or so, and was alone in this section of the house. I was stationed near where the actor would hide and jump out when the cue went off. I thought that it'd be fun to scare whoever set it off. I assumed a co-worker or the actor returning. So I waited behind the corner, but nobody ever came. Maybe someone came in but turned back. It's possible, I suppose. Around 10 minutes later, my other co-worker came up, also finishing his break. Our section all takes breaks at around the same time, and we were just talking, and the cue went off again, but nobody was there. Now, it's not a sensitive cue or anything, because whenever I work, it only goes off if someone goes through. My third co-worker thought that we were just trying to spook her when we told her what happened, but then she gasped. She didn't want to tell us at first, not wanting to seem like our story scared her, I guess, but later she said that she felt a tug going up the stairs when we were walking. That's not unheard of here, and there are many people who get that tug. Another thing that happened was I saw laundry mangled in the laundry room spin on its own, and another time I was going up to the switchback stairs, low ceiling and narrow, and turns about 7 times. And I swear to you that something shushed me right next to my ear. So, this all happened only yesterday, and I'm writing it down now while the memory is still fresh. My wife and I have been talking about it pretty much non-stop since it happened, and have been unable to come up with any explanation that doesn't involve something supernatural or inexplainable. I would love for you guys to help me figure this out so that we can just forget about it. I'll try to keep this all as short as possible too, but I need to make sure that you get all the details so you can help us figure this mess out. This is not your average "my house is haunted" story. I'm telling it to the best of my ability, and this is all 100% true, I promise you. So, yesterday, we planned on going on a 4-mile hike. The trail makes a big loop with the beginning point also acting as the ending point. And the story begins in the trail parking lot. There were about 5 other cars in the lot, and out of the car nearest to us came a middle-aged couple. We paid them no mind, as we typically do with strangers, and as we headed off to the restroom before hitting the trail, they set off on their own hike. When we started the hike, we chose Route 1, doing the loop counterclockwise. The trail itself makes a huge loop about 4 miles in length, with the parking lot being at the highest elevation, and the lowest point being the middle of the trail. The ascent from the bottom middle section to the top, going either direction, consists of giant limestone canyons that require a good bit of rock climbing, making them extremely steep, slow, slippery, and very tough to climb. And this is very important information for later. So, about 20 minutes into our overall 3-hour hike, we reached point A, where we caught up with the older couple. About the time that we caught up to them in the canyon, they decided to turn back towards the parking lot, passing us along the way. We exchanged smiles and waves as we passed, and again, we didn't think much of it. Now, from point A to point B, everything seemed pretty much totally normal. We were hot and tired, of course, but were enjoying ourselves, and thought very little about the other couple. But when we reached point B, about 2/3 of the way through the loop, just starting the uphill climb back towards the parking lot, however, things started to get a little weird. As soon as we exited the low-lying canyon region, we saw the same couple heading towards us, as if they had returned to the parking lot and opted instead for Route 2. We still didn't find this to be completely out of the ordinary, as the first canyon, around point A, was tough to get down, and it seemed that they were somewhat unprepared, if I'm being honest. I mean, the woman was wearing a knee-length skirt, a very bad choice for sliding down slippery canyon slopes and climbing steep rock bluffs. And it also appeared that they hadn't brought a pack with water in it, or anything basically. But we passed them again, exchanged pleasantries, and we just continued on. This time, though, we did talk briefly about the situation. We found it odd that they made it far enough to meet us at this point, as the first parts of routes 1 and 2 were steep and slow, and the area between point A and point B was pretty flat and steady. Considering the difference in terrain and their age, and the fact that the woman was wearing a knee-length blue jean skirt with slipperish shoes, we agreed that it was pretty strange to see them at that point in the trail, but we just continued on anyway, just shrugging it off and thinking no more about it. Soon afterwards, we made it to the outlook, which was a couple of 100 feet above the bottom section of the trail, and 10 minutes past point B. As we paused to take some pictures and catch our breath and whatnot, my wife pointed out that she could hear their voices down below in the canyon as we rested. We listened and mutually agreed that it was probably the same couple, since the point the voices seemed to be coming from would be about the right spot for them to be, given the last location we saw them at, that is, and the lack of anyone else on the trail so far. Still, nothing too strange yet. But then we reached point C. Now, between the outlook and point C, which was 20 minutes from the end of the loop and 40 minutes from point B, was a wide gravel trail with steep drop-offs on either side. You could say that it was a sort of ridge, as everything within the loop made a giant bowl, much like a volcano, with the elevation difference between the lowest point of the trail and the highest point of the trail being about 500 feet. And this made the terrain around the trail seem pretty much impossible. I mean, it was extremely steep and covered in thick undergrowth and fallen trees. It seems to be pretty much a given, too, that the established trail is the only way to get from the outlook back to the parking lot. As we neared point C, we were becoming increasingly exhausted and ready to be done. We stopped once or twice for about 30 seconds to just catch our breath, and as we got closer and closer to point C, it was as if the energy was just completely sucked out of both of us. Of course, the trail was tough, but we had done it, and many like it before too, and it was not even 80 degrees outside. Even as our mental focus began to waver, and we started noticing a significant change in our demeanor and attitude, we marched on though, knowing that the end of the trail was near. But when we reached point C, everything changed for the worse. Now, keep in mind that we saw the older couple about 40 minutes earlier at point B, and there is no way to reach point C from there except the trail that we were currently on. There were no shortcuts, there was no realistic way to pass us without us knowing, and definitely no way to possibly beat us there. And yet, there they were, sitting on a bench on the side of the trail, calmly eating lunch at that. Now, even if they did find some way to get there before us, they just didn't even have a drop of sweat on them. and their demeanor just did not fit at all to the situation. I mean, they just shouldn't have been there at all. As we passed them, the man mentioned something about a picnic to us and smiled, laughing, and we tried our best to respond in kind, but the mood was as if we had just walked into a giant black cloud of smoke. I really don't know how else to explain it too, but the area around them just disorientated us completely, and we no doubt were pale as ghosts and obviously pretty shaken. We passed on by them though, and as we were out of earshot, my wife turned to me with a face that I had never seen before in my life. We were terrified. Without saying a word to each other, we both experienced the same just feeling of shock. It felt as if we had just walked through a time warp or something, or as if we had just brushed up against another dimension. Our following discussion amounted to this too. There is no way that they could have beaten us there. Sure, maybe, possibly, just maybe there was a chance. But only if after seeing us at point B, they sprinted through the woods in a direct line towards point C. But this would have required them to run up the second canyon, steep rock bluffs, throughout the unmarked woods, and who knows what else for over a mile, in under 40 minutes as well. Now, that's how long it took us to get there, going at a pretty good speed, using the clear trail, which, as a crow flies, was not that much longer than a direct route from B to C. We're in our early 20s too, and in decent shape as well, and we were dead tired by the time that we came to see them. And based on their apparent level of preparedness and fitness, no judgment here, only stating what we could see, there is just no way, even if they did take the direct off-the-trail route, that they could have made it there before us. On top of that too, they somehow found 2 Bud Lights and a lunchbox full of sandwiches on the way, and were already almost done eating them by the time that we met them at point C. All of these things combined with just the overwhelming feelings that we got when we encountered them at point C have left us in mental shambles for the past day. It took us 6 to 8 hours to fully recover and regain our sense of normalcy. Shaken is an understatement. The hairs on our neck stood on end, and we felt almost ill, if that's the right word. But we have no idea what to make of this, and no clue how to explain it in a way that even begins to make sense. So, if you guys have any ideas, then please help us figure this one out, because it's beyond me. When I was a student teacher, I was 21 and working with mostly seniors in high school, many of which were 17 and 18 years old. Now, one day, the mentor teacher that I was working with pulled me aside from teaching my class to inform me that other teachers had overheard some students telling each other that they wanted to do something with me. While disturbing, many of my friends and colleagues insisted that that's a fact of being a young teacher working with high schoolers. The next day, I had a few girls in my class, though, approach me and inform me that 3 specific boys were no longer just talking about what they wanted to do, but were graphically describing what they were now planning on doing to me in the coming weeks after school in the parking lot. Far more details, too, than I'd like to share here. I went to the administration immediately, and they handled it very quickly and professionally. I was very grateful for their support. I was never touched nor harmed by any of these students, thankfully. But what did scare the absolute crap out of me, however, is that not even a week later, one of those boys was actually arrested and pulled out of school. I didn't find out immediately, but I eventually learned that he was being held for the alleged sexual assault of his younger sister. It makes me sick just thinking about it still, but I honestly think that I just dodged a bullet.